right, it's now 7 o'clock. And call the meeting to order. A meeting of the Planning and Economic Development Committee was held today, Wednesday, October 12th at 7 p.m. in the Aldermanic Chamber. Will the clerk please call the roll?
Alderman at Large Melbourne Moran Jr., Chairman.
Present.
Alderman at Large Michael B. O'Brien Sr., Vice Chair.
Present.
Alderman June M. Karen.
Here.
Alderman at Large Ben Clemens.
Here.
And Alderman Derek Tebow is here. We are also have Matt Sullivan, Community Development Director, Steve Buxton, Fire Chief, and we also have Sam Durfee, Planning Manager.
I think I also see the Fire Marshal there, whose name escapes me at the moment. Adam Pulio.
Okay.
All right.
So, also, I'm sorry, Mr. Chair, Bill McKinney, the building official for the city as well.
All right, and Bill McKinney. Thank you guys for coming. I appreciate it. All right, public comment. Does anyone have anything to say, members of the public, regarding tonight's agenda? Seeing none. Discussion. I'm actually going to take the discussion out of order. I think if we start with the fire department, if the chiefs wouldn't come up here, I appreciate it. So thank you both for coming. And Chief Buxton, I know we had a conversation before today's meeting about why you're here. So there's some conversation amongst board members that we would like to try to encourage building up in the city. And we want to know what the capacities are for the fire department to respond to higher builds beyond what's already existing in the city, what resources you need, how we compare to Manchester and how they would respond, and what impacts that would have. Especially, I know that you're working towards a standard for responses, and just how would that impact the fire department?
Okay, thank you. Steve Buxton, Nashua Fire. This is the Fire Marshal, Adam Pouliot. So I'll speak to the response end of things, and he can answer any questions and speak to the code end of things for us. So first off, I'd like to get out of the way. There's this myth out there that the fire department stands in the way of or has a height restriction on the development that they'll allow within the community. And I'll stand before you as your fire chief and tell you that is not the case. We obviously want a vibrant and healthy community. And you know, we do have needs as we continue to grow the city. And as long as those are met, you know, we highly encourage it. And when they're not met, we do have some means that we operate within to overcome certain things until we can meet them. You know, our bread and butter, they call it, is 2.5 story, 3 stories, wood frame buildings. That's where we do a lot of our work. If you've lived in the city for a bit of time, we have a lot of buildings that are a lot taller than that. We have some that, you know, are much between 75 and 100 feet that pose challenges for us. Modern construction has shown us many advances with wood frame buildings. We don't have to look too far from here, over on High Street, in the project that's taking place over there. We refer to that as podium construction, and that's what's coming our way. I think that's the next evolution in the city of Nashua. We're not going to see another Sullivan Terrace anytime soon because of the cost associated with the construction there. But I do think you'll see a lot more of those popping up. That, I think, is what is going to evolve here within the city. Anything above 75 feet and up, NFPA refers to as a high hazard response. A high hazard response requires us to have 43 firefighters in the initial response to the event or the incident that's taking place there. Currently, Nashua Fire Rescue has a staffing level, if everybody's available, of 38 firefighters on duty at a time. So there's very few times when I guess I would say that everybody is available to respond to a singular event within the city. As I stated earlier, we do have several buildings that are above and beyond that 75-foot mark within the community. We overcome the challenges by calling in mutual aid to assist us at the scene. And that's a good plan as we're bridging a gap, so to speak, and we're developing our city. But we're very quickly approaching the point where, you know, if I ask to borrow your lawnmower every now and again because mine breaks down, not a big deal. If I ask to borrow your lawnmower every week because I need to cut my grass, that starts to become an issue, right? Same sort of thing with mutual aid when we're starting to rely on other towns' resources consistently to mount our response to an event. It's going to create an issue with our mutual aid partners. NFPA 1710 talks about response times, staffing, and effective firefighting force. An effective firefighting force is the number of firefighters we need to carry out the 8 to 14 essential fireground tasks that need to be done at an incident. And there's a few variables that kind of play into that. Sometimes these need to take place simultaneously if the resources and the staffing is available to them. Sometimes they're not available and the incident commander is forced to prioritize those tasks. I'll give you a quick couple examples. 1710 for a single family dwelling, 17 firefighters are required to respond to that. For a garden style apartment building, open air mall, multiple family dwelling, 28 firefighters. Once we cross into that higher hazard, that 75 foot, that's where we get into the 43 firefighters. So that's the staffing end of things. The performance objectives, the first engine's supposed to arrive on scene within 4 minutes. The initial first alarm assignment, what we referred to. For a low and medium hazard, you know, the single family dwelling, the garden style apartment type dwellings, we have 8 minutes. When we get into the high hazard, we have 10 minutes to get all 43 firefighters to the scene to assemble our attack. I think from a response method, the biggest issue that we face is it takes staffing to overcome the challenge of, at a single family or multiple dwelling that's 2 or 3 stories tall, we operate from the street level and mount our attack. When you start to get up above, you know, 8, 10 stories, that 70, 75 foot mark, you're having to take all of those resources and put them up just below where the problem is and mount your attack from there. And that takes bodies, that takes staffing. So that's the biggest challenge we have. That's in the initial response. Once we've overcome that, our next obstacle is the reflex time for the secondary response, and that's to support those initial responders up there. Because now that we have all the tools and equipment we need up there, one thing we really need in firefighting is air. So our SCBAs, usually that second round of responders are bringing air bottles and those resources that we need up to our staging area at an elevated platform to help mount the attack from there. There's all sorts of studies out there developed by third parties in conjunction with the Metropolitan Fire Chiefs as far as the essential task completion and the efficiency models for it. The 4-member crew is really the ideal crew for us in the city of Nashua. When you look at places like Boston, New York City, true metropolitan areas that have a robust high hazard area, they get into 5- and 6-man crews because of they're having to overcome what I was just speaking of with the reflex time. So a 3-member crew usually takes about 12 minutes longer than a 4-member crew to perform those tasks. A 4-person crew takes 9 minutes longer than a 5-member crew and 11 minutes longer than a 6-member crew, respectively. And that's an independent study done by NIST, you know, based on science, technology, data-driven. So that's basically the responses, the response model I can speak to. At the end of the day, it takes staffing to be able to mount the appropriate response in the appropriate amount of time. And of course, that all gets tied into our ISO rating, so on and so forth. I know it's a whole lot of information in quick order, so I'm more than willing to answer any questions anybody has.
I have one quick question before I turn it over. How frequently are we using mutual aid?
I could get that data for you. We tend to currently utilize mutual aid for initial responses more on an EMS level.
Mhm.
Consistently, we do that multiple times a week. For fire responses, right now, not too bad, not unless we have a true fire working incident.
Follow up. Like the fire that was up on Amherst Street, was that a mutual aid event?
Yes.
Okay. All right.
Yep.
And that was
And-
just one story.
Yep, so at that fire, we had one, possibly two out-of-town companies operating at the scene, but we had multiple mutual aid partners covering our city at the same time.
Any questions from members? Alderman Dewitt.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to thank you for coming tonight, both to Chief Marshal Pouliot and yourself, Chief Buxton. You know, part of a safe city is not just police and health and human services, but obviously fire as well. My uncle was a firefighter in Berlin for a long time. And so I understand exactly, you know, where you guys come from. If it's up to me, I'd build a fire station up in the, I guess it's the west part of town, off Amherst Street somewhere.
Northwest.
And fill up that corridor, because I talked to John and the people from the union, and I know that, you know, we're short a fire station in the city. And, but we know as of last night, we couldn't even get 2 policemen passed. So I know that would probably be an uphill battle, but I would certainly support it. So 2 quick questions. One is, do we mutually help other towns as well? I would assume probably yes, right?
Yep, Steve Buxton, Nashua Fire. So we have mutual aid agreements. The city of Nashua belongs to 2 mutual aid groups. Sohegan, and then what we call border area. And we have mutual aid agreements in place with both parties, so we respond to them and they respond to us.
Okay. Follow up? Yep. And so, you know, we talked about the city growing last night and the need for more police because of that, but we're also growing, which would mean at some point we're going to need more firemen. Currently, what's the, where's the tallest building? Is it the one off exit 8, that glass building that goes up a little bit, or is there a taller structure than that?
So the tallest structures in the city of Nashua are Sullivan Terrace.
Okay.
Indian Head Plaza is right up there, and then of course
Is
the
that
hotels
building?
are right
Okay.
up there as well. And bear in mind that the height of the building isn't always as challenging as the access to it. So BAE down the south end has a very big building down there that is significantly tall, but the way the building's built, it makes it challenging for us to get our aerial devices to it.
Okay, I assume Sheridan Terra would be
Yep, that's
quite
right up
the
there as well.
quite the structure too. Okay, thank you.
Alderman Clemmons and Alderman O'Brien.
Thank you. And thank you for being here tonight. And thank you for your information. My question is a little bit more pointed, I guess, and I don't mean to put you on the spot, but it's clear to me, it's been clear to me for a while that we're down a fire station just to keep up with what we have currently. If we were to look to do taller buildings, would 2 additional stations from what we have now cover it, or would you say we need more robust than even that?
Steve Buxton, Nashua Fire. So to answer your question, yes. So it depends where you're building them, how far they're spread out in the building. So to use his example, if it's up off of Amherst Street and we can place a station out in the northwest quadrant where we can place an engine and an aerial, that'd be great. I think the true answer lies within the master plan. You're correct. We're struggling to keep up with what we already have in the city. So attrition-wise, we lose anywhere between 8 and 15 employees a year, whether they retire or they just go on to greener pastures. I'm pretty well convinced, based on the current climate, I'll hire 10 to 15 new people for the rest of my career. So that means we have to run a recruit school. That means we have to run a hiring process. That means I don't have the administrative staff currently within the fire department to keep up with that. So the first step is we need more administrative staff to support it, because when we start talking about adding a company, the KISS is the firehouse, the aerial device, or the engine in there. Those are easy. We can all agree on those, and it's a big price tag. But the true KISS is the 16 to 32 people we're going to put in that station from now until the end of time. Us onboarding them as an organization on top of those other 10 to 15 people that already are needed within my organization due to attrition. So you're talking about going from struggling to hold a hiring process and recruit academy for 10 people a year, possibly 15, to all of a sudden you're blowing that wide open to 30 plus people in 1 year, which that gentleman over there lived through when we built the Spitbrook Road Fire Station. Now that's a bubble within your organization that translates out 20 to 30 years, and then those people are all departing at the same time. So first step, administrative staff. Second step, land, structure, apparatus. Third step, staffing.
Follow?
Yeah, just a quick comment. I think, you know, obviously the challenge is there, but I think what I would like to see is us to be able to get this done in the next few years, because essentially the city is going to continue to grow, and we have to figure out a way that we can finance something like this. So I wouldn't be opposed to necessarily looking at a TIF district or something like that that would go right back to, you know, building a fire station, the apparatus in it, things like that. You know, so that the burden wouldn't fall necessarily on other taxpayers necessarily, but we could instead encourage development around that fire station or in that corridor and allow that. So hopefully we'll hear that tonight, but that would be my suggestion of a potential path forward for something like that. But that was just a comment.
Alderman O'Brien?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I do have one question for Fire Marshal Pouliot. Since you showed up, we might as well fire a question at you.
Fair enough.
But first let me open it up with the statement. If anybody in the city thinks that the old school Nashua is still going to be around, it's gone. And if you look at any type of development in the future, because of existing buildings, particularly in the downtown area, these are very small parcels of land. So to make any type of development within this parcel of land, people are naturally going to raise the height of the building to make it profitable in order to build it. So this is not so much a phenom. This is the accepted way that's happening in other places in America. So to that end, even though the buildings are getting taller, Fire Marshal Pouliot, you could probably tell us about the benefits of a sprinkler system and the type of constructions and the sheetrock and everything else that kind of assist us, the fire department, in buying some time before we can get a crew there to extinguish it. So these buildings are actually quite safe and everything to be habitable by the people.
Yep. Again, Fire Marshal Adam Pouliot. Yeah, what we're seeing right now is the chief had mentioned, you know, 5, 6, up to 7-story wood frame construction. Wood frame construction is always a concern because it's a combustible product. But as we get up in height, you know, different code restrictions apply. So extra safety features are in these buildings. So yes, as you stated, they're fully sprinklered. Depending on the height of the building and the water supply available in the area, some of these buildings need fire pumps to make sure that we've got the water we need on the upper floors. Once you get above 30 feet in height, you're required to have standpipe systems in your stairwells. And as the chief had said, you know, becomes a tactics change for us. Instead of connecting hose to the engine, bringing the hose from the street up into the building, now we're bringing high-rise packs in the building. We're operating off standpipes inside. So the water's there. We just get it from inside in the stairwell. You know, our stairwells are our escape route. They are fire separated from the common corridors and the rest of the building. So if somebody's, say, handicapped and unable to make it down the stairs, if they can at least get to the stairwell, they're inside a protected area. So there's a lot of safety features that come into these buildings as we start to go up in height.
Mm-hmm. follow up if I may. The other one is a general overview, and Chief Buxton, I'll put you on the hot seat if you want on this. But according to my recollection and being a former member of the department, the last fire station that was built was the Spitbrook Road Station. Am I correct in assuming that? I think in approximately 1977.
Steve Buxton, National Fire. So if you're speaking of the last building that was built for the fire department.
Right, I'm not talking,
add-
and if I may to clarify.
Yep.
Yes, the fire department has been very proactive, and rightfully so, in protecting the infrastructure of rehabbing stations, make them quality places to, you know, house people.
Yep.
Again, I worked at the former Crown Hill Station, which I wouldn't even kept my dog in the building, but they put us there instead. But the last building that was actually intended, a new building, was the Spitbrook Road Station, approximately 1977.
77 or 78, correct.
All right, would you believe, according to my math, that was 45 years ago.
I believe your math.
So in 45 years, I wonder how many ghosts of aldermen past have sat in this chamber and for 45 years did nothing to look to address this particular issue. And then also too, I think the next station that was built prior to that was the Connor Road Station, and that was 1971. So that was 51 years ago. So if you wanted to save $1, I think we saved $1 for 45 years at least, and not, you know, getting, you know, looking at getting stations. And would you agree with me in the statement, you know, as a former deputy chief, I didn't care how much shiny red fire trucks I had at the scene. I didn't need the trucks, I needed the manpower. It always comes down to that one guy with the biggest pair that's gonna be at the end of that line that's gonna really save the particular day. And, you know, so on those apparatus and getting a new station will be the manpower that I think we're gonna need in this type of structure. So can you just touch briefly, even though we're going up in height, the fire department has already plans of high-rise response, tactical operations, and everything else. The book has already been written and the ink has been dry in many other communities, and it can be easily applied to Nashua as well, correct?
Steve Buxton, Nashua Fire. So Alderman O'Brien, I couldn't state it better than that. We do need a ride to the incident, for lack of a better way to put it. And we do have a lot of tools in, you know, those big toolboxes we carry around with us. But the staffing on those trucks is actually what does the work. That's what, as I said, takes the battle from the street attached to the truck and puts it up in that elevated area. Sometimes we utilize the stairs. Some of the modern technology allows us to utilize the elevator, which in his day was not allowed. Everything was up the stairs. So the tactics have changed a little bit, but this, you know, these tactics are tried and true: evacuation stairways, attack stairways. We're not reinventing the wheel here, but what is very important, the formula has been written for us. There's a standard in place for our response. We need to be able to meet those numbers with our staffing, because, you know, an old saying is, as the first line goes the entire fire. And if we're chasing it from the start because we weren't able to put that first line in place appropriately, we're fighting a losing battle, and we're trying to correct it the whole way.
Thank you. All of you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As a 10-year-old boy, I lived right behind Chestnut Street Fire Station. I'm sure Alderman O'Brien was in his heyday over at Crown,
You mean
Crown
Lake,
Hill.
Lake Street?
So that is completely decommissioned now as a dispatch station, right? That couldn't be used at all ever for a fire station again, or?
Correct, Steve Buxton, Nashua Fire. So in 1998 timeframe, we placed that station out of service, and we opened the Lake Street Community Fire Station down the street, which is, you know, probably one of the first modern firehouses we built, as he pointed out, in many years. I hate to correct him in front of everybody, but the construction of Conant Road wasn't an addition to our firehouses, it's a replacement for Central Fire Station, They moved headquarters to that temporary location in 1971 out at 2 Connaught Road. And that temporary headquarters stood for approximately 30-plus years until we opened the Lake Street Community Fire Station and moved headquarters over there. So then they rehabbed that building for the communications center. That would not be fit to be a fire station at this point in time, mostly due to the size of the apparatus that we have, and we would have to find a place for the communications center, obviously.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
Alderman Karen?
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Chief. I know what good work you guys do. So my question to you is, we talked about numbers. Are you at maximum numbers of firefighters that you need to cover all those stations, or are you short like the police department? Numbers are lower than what they would like to see.
Steve Buxton, Nashville Fire. So we're currently down members. Now, that's because we choose to hire once a year. So we run a little bit different model than the police department, where they can send a couple people up to the police academy. We hire people that are already certified. Our hiring qualifications, you have to meet a certain certification level. And then we run our own recruit school in the city, which depending on the size of the class is anywhere between 5 and 7 weeks. And then those individuals are placed on the line. So our recruit school is usually held in the spring. So current staffing level, as of next week, will be down 11 personnel within the organization. And as I stated earlier, I'm pretty well convinced that for the rest of my career, which has several days left in it, we'll be hiring 10 to 15 people most years.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Alderman O'Brien?
Yeah, Chief Buxton, if I may, you're probably going to kill me for letting the cat out of the bag, but where I sit as chairman of infrastructure, I'm big on infrastructure. To me, it's shameful to sit there as the chairman of infrastructure and see nice buildings and everything because of trying to squeeze, the penny, that the buildings basically fall apart. And you have that, from what I understand. You referred to the former Lake Street station. Those stations were actually intended for horse-drawn apparatus. And we only have one that's still active and involved. But you got to look what's on them right now and sitting there. I think an engine company, you're probably talking 16-ton. Ladder company, you're probably up to 18-plus ton. It's a transitional load traveling across the floor that's over a cellar. Any engineer will tell you, you're on borrowed time, with that. And today, when we build new fire stations, such as the last one that was built was the replacement to the Crown Hill station, which is the Arlington Street station, was actually slab type of construction. There is a basement, but the apparatus is not parked over the basement. But I remember fondly of watching, spalling concrete and tires going through the floor, you know what I mean? And so a lot of that was never really taken care of equally as well. So I anticipate and I hope that some day that we start to look at Chief Buxton, when he comes into meetings and brings the point home, that somebody in this chamber will pay attention and listen, because it's not just the shiny red trucks that we're purchasing. It's the manpower that's doing the job, the facilities that they live in, and making the whole complete work environment. And again, if we go, and I stand corrected, you're right, it did replace the old Central Station, which, yeah, you did get me on that one, which also ran horse and buggy out of it too. But 45 years is ridiculous by any municipality standard of increasing the size of the force. And to that vein, Chief, if I may follow up with the question, are you seeing an increase of demand of services annually within the fire department?
Steve Buxton, Nashville Fire. Absolutely. We don't categorize calls by fire, EMS anymore, we categorize them by calls for service. So that's some level of business that was done with the fire department. This past year, I believe we were at 54,000 calls for service per year. Now that's not just somebody calling up and asking if there was school today or not. That's these guys doing inspections, that's emergency responses, as you know, when the trucks go down the street, that's the trucks going out to give out a burn permit or a permit being issued online. So, some form of work was done with the fire department and somebody within the community within that number. So that's a drastic increase from your day or even 2-3 years ago.
Very good. Alderman Tebow?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So, I mean, that's a great point. People think firemen fighting fires. You guys do a ton of other stuff to help the city and to, emergency response is big too. And, I see fire trucks going up my street for whatever reason. And most of the time, probably 99.9% of the time, it's not because of any kind of fire. So, thank you for that. I think, as I think 3 of us, maybe 4 or 5, I don't know, have said stuff about, we would support another fire station, we would support more help. That's going to be a fight to get that pushed through, I'll tell you that right now. And you probably know that being in many of these meetings that, people are going to come up, you can't bond for that, or you can't do this for that, or there's no money, TIF doesn't make sense, or whatever. And I hope that we can figure out something, because at some point, we're going to get to that point where we're too big and the fire staff is too low. And you're going to have to cut out something that's essential to keeping people safe and well. And I think that's going to be a fight that shouldn't be a fight, just like police. Those are 2 things that are essential to have a good city, a good society. And, I just wanted to thank you guys again for what you do. It's incredibly important. So thank you.
Thank you. Is that something that's in the master plan that says by this time frame you'll have another fire station?
Steve Buxton, Nashville Fire. So the master plan lays out a whole bunch of stuff for us. So it talks about our call volume increasing, the workload increasing. When they wrote the master plan in 2021, we were in the sweet spot. That means we had enough units and we had enough staffing to balance our emergency responses with our training and certification requirements. It outlined our strengths as well as our weaknesses. Where we were falling short, we had understaffed the fire marshal's office for years, and they were struggling to even keep up with police assembly inspections. So it's all the information is there, all the data is there for us. One of the things that it also outlines in there, to Alderman O'Brien's point, is the city needs to get ready to invest in the infrastructure of the fire department. We have 8 facilities that we need to take care of. And I would challenge you to look within the fire department budget and compare it to other departments within the city that don't have 8 facilities, and look at the lines that we use to maintain our buildings. And we're squeezing all of the juice out of the orange, trust me. And we do pretty well with it, but one of the things I'll be coming forward with is a study of our infrastructure, engineering wise. We have some buildings, as he pointed out. 15 Amherst Street was built in 1880 something, I believe. And it's one of our busier stations. It's within the historic district. There's a lot of challenges there that we're going to have to, a lot of bridges that we're going to have to cross, and that services that northwest quadrant in the initial response. So there's a lot of work to be done there, but the roadmap, my predecessor, Chief Rhodes, Alderman Dowd was a big supporter of the master plan and helped us secure funding for it. The Board of Aldermen at the time accepted it. The roadmap is there. We just need to follow it. And I'm a realist. I've been around a few days here, and I recognize the challenges that lie ahead of us to overcome these things. But I think if we take slow, steady steps towards it in the right direction and do it strategically, we'll be successful.
Any more questions for the fire department? All right. Thank you so much, Chiefs, for coming. I appreciate it.
Thank you very much for the invite.
Thank you for your time. Will the planning department please come up and join us? Director Sullivan and his team are here to discuss potential rezoning and overlays for some sections of Amherst Street. And then we also may discuss maybe binding residents here and build up.
Okay. Great. Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chair, members of the committee. For the record, Matt Sullivan, Community Development Division Director, joined by Sam Durfee, the city's new planning department manager this evening. And I just want to thank you for having what we consider a proactive conversation this evening about potential rezoning along both the Amherst Street corridor and the Daniel Webster corridor in the south of Nashua. And the reason that I refer to it as proactive is that, as you're all aware, we are heading into a comprehensive land use code update that's scheduled to begin in the coming months, which I refer to as comprehensive, but will focus on several priority redevelopment and development opportunity areas within the city that were targeted as part of the Imagine Nashua 2021 master plan for those who had an opportunity to participate in that. One clarification, the chief referred to a master plan. That's actually the fire department's strategic plan. If you're not aware, that's not actually the land use master plan that was enacted, albeit in the same year and very close to the same time back in 2021. So just to give you an outline of what we'll review this evening, we're going to talk a little bit about process, what the rezoning process looks like. Some of you are very familiar, obviously. We certainly are not trying to preach to you, of course, but we do want to remind everyone of what this process might look like in the event that we do move forward with some small efforts of rezoning in sort of this gap period between the master plan being done and the land use code being done. We'll talk specifically about some opportunities for introducing an expansion of the mixed-use overlay district, and we'll talk about what that is, into the Amherst Street corridor. And we'll also talk a bit about the Daniel Webster corridor, which I would argue is a bit more complicated when it comes to incentivizing vertical development, mixed-use development, and residential development. And we'll talk a little bit about why that is. And then we'll close with an overview of where we're headed with the land use code update. We've been keeping the planning board apprised of this at some level, but we want to keep the PEDC informed as well as we head into the actual process of working with the community, conducting public input exercises, and actually drafting an iteration of the code for you all to review, and Sam will talk in a bit more detail about all of that. One thing I do want to put out there right away, and the chief did something similar in his conversation, is that we want to correct some facts this evening about what impediments there may be to vertical expansion within the city, not just in the downtown area, but also in some of our peripheral residential areas, mixed-use areas, and commercial areas. In many of those areas, and we'll review this in detail tonight, we actually have incredibly permissive zoning as a community. It either allows for really limitless height through the authority of the planning board's review, or there are very liberal height limitations in place that allow for construction at up to 10 stories. That said, from a geographic perspective, that's actually a very small area of the community, but it tends to align with where we'd like to focus our redevelopment efforts because of the availability of infrastructure and other factors, and we'll talk a little bit about that this evening. But I just want to reiterate that, again, it's not the zoning that's necessarily keeping us from incentivizing redevelopment. It's a complex balance between the zoning, the regulatory environment, the market conditions themselves, the risk awareness of the development community. All of those things sort of lead us to this place where we're starting to see redevelopment and development, but we need more market activity to actually incentivize more. One thing that wasn't discussed specifically as part of the fire department discussion this evening is that we do have this very interesting gap in what our zoning allows for and what we're seeing in development right now. You'll note that some of the new construction we're seeing is between 6 and 7 stories, but we're not seeing, even in our zones that allow 10-story construction, that level of verticality. And there are reasons behind that. There are construction standards within the building code, within the fire code, that actually disincentivize buildings between 7 stories and really 12 to 13 to 14 to 15. And that's because there's a requirement to move to a steel form of construction. And that becomes very, very expensive. As a result, the development community needs more and more height in order to make the numbers work for that form of development. And so I want to make everyone aware of that so that when we're talking about height restrictions, we're not just thinking about zoning being the primary impediment, but I digress. Again, the intent this evening is really to begin a conversation about some limited rezoning and what we might look at doing in this gap period between the master plan and the land use code update. That's based on some conversations I've had with Alderman Moran, others, certainly Alderman Clemmons as well, and I've heard the commentary at these meetings in the past about the interest in going not only with more mixed use, more residential, but also in a more vertical form. And we want to be as responsive as we possibly can to that as part of this discussion. Our primary role is in fact to support you. It's to support the mayor and his initiatives, obviously, but it's also to support the planning board. And I want to point out the planning board element of things because we're going to end up talking about the mixed use overlay and the transit-oriented development district this evening. In order to make those development districts work, which are very flexible, a lot of the authority ends up being shifted to the planning board and away from the zoning board and strict zoning constraints. And so the planning board is a critical stakeholder of any conversation that we're having about potentially creating new mixed-use zones or new transit-oriented zones. And so I just want everyone to be aware of that when we're kind of thinking about this evening. I also want to emphasize the fact that although we're supportive of investigating additional rezoning, we want to stick to the existing regulatory toolkit that we have. And what I mean by that is that in this gap period, I am hesitant to introduce large-scale new zoning districts. And so I am very willing to talk about the expansion of existing overlay districts that we have that are working well. But the idea of creating new zoning, I have concerns about, and I'll talk about that in a little more depth so that you don't feel like that's an arbitrary feeling that I'm having this evening. And then lastly, we will end, of course, by talking a little bit about the land use code and how the efforts of, or the interests of this committee might be supported by the update that goes on through that process. Again, as you're all aware, the rezoning process is fairly straightforward. Ultimately, the source can be different. It can be from petitioner. It can be, of course, from a member of the Board of Aldermen. It might be via a staff member through a member of the Board of Aldermen. It can come through the mayor, of course. But ultimately, that will be referred here to the PEDC for the public hearing process. There'll be a planning board referral process where the planning board looks at the proposed rezoning within the context of their master plan. But ultimately, it's the aldermanic authority to approve the zoning change. And so that's why we're before you this evening to discuss the potential action that we're looking at. I wanted to start with Amherst Street, and certainly to Alderman Clemmons' comments and the fire discussion about the lack of infrastructure or fire infrastructure on the Amherst Street corridor. I think there's some tension between what our long-term development goals are for the Amherst Street corridor and what the availability of infrastructure is along that corridor, and with the vision of what the master plan laid out. And so just as a brief refresher, I'm sorry if you've heard this many, many times, but the Imagine Nashua vision from the 2021 master plan is very ambitious for the Amherst Street corridor. It speaks to really a mixed-use build front corridor that's complemented by a series of really carriageways that include not only an alternative multimodal path and vehicle access, but also some stormwater management techniques that are green in nature. And what does that all mean? Pictures speak, I think, volumes really. And so what we're talking about, and this is sort of a section that I would urge you to think about the Somerset Plaza area when looking at this cross section right here. This is an area where we would propose upzoning along the Amherst Street corridor in the form of mixed use and residential buildings, the creation of surface parking lots, although hopefully limited size parking lots behind, and then the preservation of some of the commercial and other uses that exist there today. What really I think is perhaps a bit jarring about these images is the idea of build front buildings right along the sides of the Amherst Street corridor. That's certainly not what we have today. We have many 1-, 2-, and 3-story buildings that are set back with substantial surface parking lots directly adjacent to the corridor. And as part of the master plan, we identified that that's not, in fact, the most productive use of land, and that's not what the community wants, and that's not what you expressed you wanted to see. And so we laid out some general recommendations about increasing density, increasing the height that's allowed along this corridor, and generally looking at our land use values and encouraging that the code encourages the right development principles and really the right design aesthetic for the corridor as well, because that's something we're lacking on. You can open the door to height, you can open the door to density, but the form is also very, very important, and the look and feel of what you're creating is incredibly important. We have, unfortunately, very limited design standards within the city of Nashua right now, and I think in some ways some of the development product that we've seen is a result of that, and we're seeing some of that play out. Additionally, as I mentioned before, we do want to really shift the character of this towards being a less vehicle-centric corridor. That said, we know Amherst Street is what it is. It's a major, it's a major east-west thoroughfare. It's a major commute road. It's a major regional thoroughfare. We're not going to put our blinders onto that, right? We recognize that that will need to be maintained. that's really the basis of this idea of some other collector streets or other access ways along the corridor that would help alleviate some of the access mitigation or access management issues that we see. But I think it's important to keep this vision in mind when we talk about where we're headed from a rezoning perspective, and also keeping in mind what the existing uses are in the corridor. That's a huge piece of what we need to understand. And I really broke the corridor in my mind down into 3 specific sections. They're not all completely unique in nature, but I believe they do have some uniqueness to them. I know it's a little bit hard to see here, but the first is Northwestern Boulevard to State Street, which is approximately right here. This is generally an area that's characterized by large or big box retail stores and other commercial uses. There are some warehousing uses to the southern side of the Amherst Street corridor, but it's also important to remember that to the north side of the corridor, some of our highest concentration of high density and medium density residential in the city. You don't really think about it. Some of it's tucked away behind some of that retail and other development, but this is a mixed use corridor in a way, just not in the sense that it's all on the same property. So that's sort of that first piece of the corridor. I will also just note that we've had very limited interest from the development community in doing redevelopment in that first section. Those are very well-established uses. Vacancy has been relatively low, and so there hasn't been a great sense of urge from the development community to redevelopment in that first section of the corridor. From State Street to Somerset Parkway is its own unique geography. This is actually an area where we have seen interest from the development community. There are new apartments being developed off of Dumaine and Deerwood. That's an existing residential area where we've seen additional interest in the development community and new construction underway there. We've also heard some interest from the existing warehouse uses to the south there off of State Street, the Amazon distribution facility area, about potentially redeveloping those properties. And so this is an area of real redevelopment interest and one where we've seen some interest in doing residential development where the zoning doesn't necessarily align with that. On the north side of that section, it's again more medium to high density residential with commercial directly up against the Amherst Street corridor. And then lastly, from the Somerset Parkway to the Everett Turnpike, this is really sort of the Whole Foods section, the Law Trucking area, the Somerset Plaza area. This is fairly well defined with some residential obviously off of the street, but we also have some potential interesting redevelopment opportunities along in some of those commercial and warehousing uses in the future. I think it's no secret that there have been discussions on some of the Law Trucking properties about the ability of doing something else with those long term. Although there's no specific development course for that, we do anticipate that there might be an opportunity to do a large mixed-use development somewhere in this section of the corridor, but not in the immediate future. I just want to summarize by saying quickly that where we have seen interest in redevelopment of residential and some verticality is really in this core section between State Street and Somerset Parkway, and we believe that the market might demand it in that area. I would be remiss, however, if I did not identify some challenges and some questions that we have, and these are just for consideration for our conversation this evening. One, this is a limited access right-of-way. Access management is extremely challenging along the corridor. In some sections, there are DOT interests where there are limited access right-of-way, and there's a level of permitting associated with that, despite it being in the urban compact. Again, the levels of congestion, the high volume, not so much so the speed, but there are challenges along this corridor that we do have to deal with, but there are existing access and intersection, there's existing access and intersection infrastructure that is in place that could be utilized. We are planning to potentially move away from, or not potentially, but we're planning to move away from what was contemplated as an expansion of Amherst Street and actually a redesigning of Amherst Street to be more bike and ped friendly, which is directly intersecting with our goals from the master plan. That said, we do have some concern, although we don't understand the capacity issues here, about whether or not large-scale redevelopment and rezoning of this area to allow high-density residential would in fact be handled by the existing water and sewer that exists in place along the corridor. That's not to say it could not be done, but it's something that if we were looking at a large-scale rezoning, we'd have to be cognizant of. And in short, a large-scale redevelopment effort, a large-scale rezoning is not something that I believe we're prepared to discuss tonight, but I think it is something that we do need to address over the next year and 2 years as we're gearing up for the release of a recodification of this corridor as a whole. That said, I do believe that there is an existing opportunity, albeit in a very small geography, to create an opportunity for more mixed-use overlay zoning. And again, the mixed-use overlay zone that Sam will introduce in just a second is really an overlay zone that gives the planning board incredible latitude to approve or disapprove of development proposals of various heights, designs, uses, provided that they meet the intent of the master plan, and Sam will talk about that in just a few minutes. But before I do that, I do want to say that there is precedent for installing mixed use along this corridor, and it's very difficult to see here, but I'll try to point out with my mouse. As we look at some of the core area to the east of Round Pond, and almost in that core section that I'm talking about, the park industrial zoning that's in place has actually already been overlain with mixed use, and that's what's incentivized some of the redevelopment that we're seeing happen there. The same goes for some of the area directly adjacent to the airport, but more towards the Somerset Parkway area. Mixed use has already been installed there as an effort to incentivize redevelopment. It's been less successful because there are very established commercial and other uses in that area. But we believe from a long-term planning perspective that if we're looking at the master plan as the vision for this corridor, this mixed-use zoning is a good indicator for developers right now that we do have a broader and more ambitious vision for the corridor. Before I go further and make any recommendations, I want Sam to just talk quickly a little bit about the nuts and bolts of the mixed-use overlay. I know this is not the most exciting stuff in the world, but it's important to understand how these overlay zones function if we're talking about an extension of any of them as an action item from the committee meeting this evening.
Sure, thank you. Sam Durfee, Planning Manager. So as Matt's alluded to, there's a lot of flexibility built into the mixed-use overlay district. It's clear that there is some appetite to incentivize through regulatory actions more residential development, height, and at a higher density than we typically see. I think there's a lot of conversation to be had around infrastructure, whether that's roadway capacity, water, sewer, fire, very poignantly spoken about tonight. This is a heavily utilized corridor. And so where we plug in this regulatory incentive, that's going to be part of the conversation. But as we also talk about the residential component, there are naturally services that we want to see associated with high-density residential, some of which already do exist on this corridor. It can be ranging from convenience stores to, that corner grocery, which may not typically be, what you would see on this sort of a corridor because this is your typical strip mall development. But, some of those services are already baked into the fabric of this area. Again, the code and the way that this district is written, a lot of latitude given to the planning board. Dimensional waivers can be granted, some to use, some to density. So from the perspective of what this can do, it is a good district to apply in this area, overlaying in nature. The way it's currently written, though, it does have some design standards in it. Does talk about form, which we'll get into a little bit more when we talk about the code, but a lot of those end with in conformance with the surrounding area. So if you look at the picture on the bottom, that really is your typical strip mall development, and when you look at the picture on the left, these buildings fronting the street, when you say you want to conform with the surrounding areas, well, the surrounding areas are not reflective of what's been articulated in the master plan. So really a clear area where we need to update that with this code update. But I think the intent is there for this densification of the area, the diversity of uses by really introducing a lot more dense residential development. I think the intent is there, but how we do it, we need to get a little bit more creative.
Yeah, I think Sam hit on an important point there, and that is that so much of this very flexible zoning that we have does rely on the surrounding character of the area. And so when we install it in a place that's not well designed already or isn't in line with our vision for the community, we're perpetuating many of the same uses. The one saving grace, if you will, that we have within that mixed use overlay is that it does call directly to the master plan and says that the board can consider the master plan and really align a development proposal with what the master plan's objectives are, not necessarily in the face of the existing character of the area, but certainly in an effort to incentivize development that maybe the current area does not display. So I think it's just interesting to think about that. And so what I would like to propose for consideration this evening, and it sounds like this may be part of the beginning of a conversation with this committee, is a rezoning of the proposed area below to a mixed-use overlay zone. And in the interest of transparency and clarity, There are portions of this proposed area that are already mixed-use overlay. So I want to be very, very clear about that. However, there are some relic parcels, one being I'll refer to it as the Building 19 property. Perhaps I shouldn't. I don't think I should refer to it as the Walmart property. I do know that. This is one that's actually, oddly enough, not zoned for mixed-use overlay. It's a relic where it's simply zoned based on the underlying zoning district. And we can say publicly that we've had conversations with the development community that have been frustrated about that. And this is a very large parcel with good access to the corridor. So there's a lot of bang for buck with just modifying the zoning on this one property. I would also suggest that we need to bring the mixed-use overlay over to the west of that property onto some of the existing industrial, warehouse, and low-density residential properties. We believe that there is adequate infrastructure to at least accommodate some level of redevelopment in those areas. And so what I would like to start the conversation on, or perhaps return with a more formal map on, is the idea of extending this mixed-use overlay over the area that I've circled in pink here. And just, if you can't get a good sense of this, this is the edge of round pond right up here. This is obviously down here, we're talking about the area directly adjacent to the Building 19 entrance, where you can see my mouse right here. So it's really that extent of the corridor.
And across the street, which we were just talking about, was the plaza that caught fire.
Correct.
And they're gonna rebuild, and maybe they can rebuild if we have this overlay now with mixed use.
The idea is opening the door for that. Mm-hmm. We certainly wouldn't want to comment on the property where we don't have some level of planning or site control for it directly, but I think what we really want to do here is open that door for a conversation with the city about what our priorities might be for development or redevelopment. There are also some really interesting properties. The property adjacent to Dunkin' Donuts has sat vacant for a long time, if you can recall that one. Some challenging topography, but I would argue that the regulatory environment has not sweetened the pot quite enough for the redevelopment of that site. So you're absolutely right, Alderman Moran. There are some underutilized properties that I think might take advantage of this install of the overlay zoning, but really time will have to tell us whether it's actually effective or not.
Alderman Clemens.
Thank you. So what I would, as you pointed out, my only hesitation would be that I don't want to perpetuate what's there. And however, that being said, I also don't want this to become Route 1 in Saugus or Lynn, where you drive down that and it's 3 lanes of a very busy highway with really tall buildings on either side and people going 50 miles an hour either way. And that's if you're lucky, because most of the time you're sitting in traffic and it's awful. And that is not what I want to see on Amherst Street. And so you have to find that balance of how do we redevelop that without making it, for lack of a better term, I hate to pick on Saugus, but that's kind of like what I would not want to see. So how do you balance that? Because when you look at that picture that you had before of the tall buildings, yeah, that one, that's what comes to mind. And so how do you make that, I guess, more appealing to somebody who, is maybe thinking like I am?
Yeah, it's a great question. A few thoughts come to my mind. I mean, one, I think, and having driven that corridor many, many times, access management is one of the critical issues there. As you know, the turning movements are incredibly dangerous based on the speeds. And so this does go hand in hand with this repurposed NHDOT project that we're talking about that is really intended to traffic calm. And I know we overuse that term, but it really is intended to traffic calm all of the movement along the corridor. And so I really think one of the critical things in avoiding that is limiting the size of the road geometry such that it does not incentivize people to travel at a high rate of speed. I think that's a critical piece of it. It's not everything, though. I also think we need to be very careful, and frankly, there's some hesitance on our end about some of this rezoning with that in mind. And one of the things that we're thinking about is if we truly are effective at opening the door to development here, with really not a great sense of what the actual design outcomes are that we want, we may get a lot of development that we're really not happy with. And so that's why we're a little bit hesitant, quite frankly, to do a large-scale rezoning, because we don't totally have our arms around what the outcomes might be. And so the real answer to your question is, I think we need to have very deliberate design standards around what we want in this corridor, not just from an architectural perspective, but from a site design perspective, so that we're not creating the horrific corridor that you see in some areas like the one that you referenced.
Yeah, follow-up. Well, see, and that's why I kind of don't necessarily think that, I know it's in the master plan, but the way that we have it designed now up there, if you think about Somerset Plaza and what's behind there, the hotel, the glass building, all the hotels back there, it's designed so that the development you get off of Amherst Street, right? And then you're kind of in an area. And to me, when I think of modern developments and things like that, you want the corridor to be how you get there and then off the beaten track somewhere else. Like I think about like what they did. I don't know if you've ever been over to Londonderry in like the 603 brewery, yeah, that they have like a whole like downtown that they kind of are trying to create. And the idea is, right, you go up 102 and you get off and you go past the plaza and then there's everything right there. And so that to me is more of the type of development, at least in my mind, that I think is a better fit for that area and the type that we should be encouraging, as opposed to right on Amherst Street, you know, right there, a building there, and then parking in the back. To me, Amherst Street is a corridor that serves not just Nashua, but Milford, Amherst, all of those areas. You have hundreds of thousands of people traveling back and forth to go to work and things like that. So I don't know, that's my concern, I guess, with building directly onto Amherst Street.
Dr. Sullivan?
Just a brief comment. I do want to say that, first of all, I fully agree. You know, we've had conversations about the idea of village-style development off of the corridor. My personal perspective is that that's exactly what we want, and I would be comfortable with the vertical development along the corridor as long as it's part of something, right? As long as it's part of a larger development.
Yes.
And one of the concerns that Sam and I have had is that we don't really have the street network behind to actually support this redevelopment and this development. That's going to take an incredible amount of time, but if you think about the Pheasant Lane Mall area, the city was actually very successful at creating these other sort of linking streets and driveways that have taken congestion and traffic off of the DW corridor, and we'll get to that in a few minutes. So we really need to be deliberate from a transportation perspective about anticipating this growth and redevelopment that we want to create. And I'm not sure we're doing that with I'm not sure we're doing that to the level that I'm comfortable with. If we're going to talk about a large scale rezoning, can we do it in a small area that we accept is already sort of moving in this direction? Possibly. But to execute this larger vision for the corridor, we're going to have to be very much more, and Dan, I can hear Dan Hudson speaking in my ear about this too, we're going to have to be much more deliberate about the transportation planning component of this, because otherwise it's simply not going to work.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. On the flip side, to Alderman Clemmons, right, we don't want it to be Saugus, but it can't be a parking lot either, right? And I know I've driven down Amherst Street when there was no exit 8. I mean, for a long, long time, and I've just seen that place grow and grow. Milford Amherst, or I should say Amherst Hollis area there, that's just grown like crazy. There, well, you know, plenty of stores that came up, went down, went back up. And, you know, if I'm going out to Milford, I won't go back down Amherst Street. I go into Merrimack, and I take the highway off exit, whatever that is, 10. Just because, and my dad lives in South Nashua, so I mean South Merrimack, so I drive that a lot. But because I don't want to go down Amherst Street, because it's light, 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 and so I think it's an ugly development, Amherst Street, to be honest. It's like you said, it's all different shapes and sizes, and it doesn't fit anywhere, and there's all kinds of different things there, and it's just I think it needs some redevelopment. I mean, we can't just sell Christmas trees in that huge lot, right? You know, it's got to be. I mean, when I was young, it was Hampshire Farms, it was Keeley Farms, it was Builders Square. I mean, it was places before, and for some reason, places couldn't stay there. I don't know, maybe it was the rent because it was huge, a huge lot, right? we built that Hampton Inn right on the corner there, which I think is a horrible place to put it's like right on the corner. Used to be a ground round, right? That, to me, made more sense there. It's a tough corner. It's just a tough corner to drive in and out of. So I think there needs to be some redevelopment there. There's, like you said, there's lots of factors to determine whether or not what we can do and what we can't do. And I mean, I would love to see it change. I just don't know how we can do that effectively with traffic. And if you can make other, you got obviously you got exit 8, and you can go through Merrimack exit 10, or you can go all the way down and go through exit 6 or whatever. But other than that, you're stuck in the middle. And, I know we have to try to put a fire station up there somewhere, and that's going to be an issue. But I'm for it. We're obviously going to need more information before it gets to any point where we have a more serious discussion on it.
The responsible planner on this side of my, on the shoulder maybe is telling me, and I hate to suggest study because that's what planners do, right? But this is an area where I really do feel that we need an intermediate level of corridor study that takes components of what the master plan suggested, components of what we're talking about tonight, and actually articulates that in something that we can put in the form of code. And I know that's exactly what Director Marchand had in mind. This was not intended to be the final product, obviously. There needed to be more study in order to actually execute this vision. But I truly do feel the more that I look at this, the more study is absolutely necessary if we're going to do this on a larger scale. I do think there are things we could do to incentivize a village-style development in some sections of the corridor that are not otherwise constrained. But if a developer were to walk into our offices today, I would not know what guidance to give them as to how, what the vision should be for that. I would be forced to point to other developments in other sections of the state, quite honestly. And I'm not sure that's what Nashua as a city actually wants. And so it's cheap of me to say, but I do think that we need some level of further study of the corridor that looks at all of these infrastructure issues in light of what's, I think, a shared vision for some level of redevelopment and upzoning of the area.
Alderman Clemens?
Well, to that point though, there is sort of an idea of what you want it to look like, at least in my mind. If you know right where Bertucci's is, and you go behind there, and you have all of those office buildings, and it's very nice, and there's ponds, and the streets are very, if you've ever driven back there, I envision in my mind, I go, okay, this is perfect for mixed use because you have office buildings that are there, right? And you could easily put in residential and have them have access to what essentially are beautiful parks all in there. And so when I think about, okay, we're gonna make this a mixed use, I think my immediate thought is, yeah, and I'd love to see residential go right into that spot because it's already kind of set up for that type of a development. That'd be a place I would want to live or I would want to, start out. And so on the other side of the street where the hotels are, that's the same thing behind the Somerset Plaza. I forget the name of that street that circles around where the tower is, but that's sort of along the same lines. So if you can get development, like if they tore down Building 19 and did something like that in there, that I could see being very successful. I could see us requiring that they build streetscapes and tie into the next development that comes along, and then that street gets tied in, and then eventually as developments go, you have a thing that connects all the way down to Round Pond or something like that. But that's sort of, I think when, I don't think you'd have to point necessarily to other communities, but I think you could look at that and say, that's sort of what the vision would be, at least in my mind.
Question. You guys have come up with a small parcel that you are okay with rezoning with an overlay now. for the entirety of the corridor, you would be recommending a study to look at what exactly?
What I'm recommending for the rest of the corridor is that we, through the land use code update, have a direct conversation about this corridor and what our design objectives are. Because what we'll talk about in a few minutes is that the code form that we're talking about is much more directed at what the actual product of development will be rather than the uses that are on the site. And so I would recommend that as part of the land use code update, we make a concerted effort to look at the Amherst Street corridor amongst DW and others that have been selected and have this conversation and perhaps have it here of all places. You know, I think that's really what I'm recommending. I am not recommending a full-blown corridor study. If you remember the East Hollis Street corridor study that was done in 2004, and when I say not recommending, I'm not saying that's not the right idea, because perhaps we should do that. But I think the interim step is to use the land use code update as a forum for this discussion to happen in a more productive way than I think we're equipped to lead it tonight.
Great. Because this piece of land that you're recommending, you've already said that there's other similar developments happening around.
Yep.
You have the potential for whatever's going to go on with that plaza that needs to be rebuilt. Slowing down the ability to put an overlay there might lose people who are interested if they're already building across the street, for example.
I don't think that it will. One of the great features of the mixed-use overlay district is that it really does not overly burden existing development or ongoing construction in any way, nor would it turn away any interest that developers have in properties in this area right now. If anything, it likely opens the door for a more streamlined regulatory process that goes through the planning board only. So I would not be concerned about impacts to, you know, proposed, permitted, or in construction developments that are ongoing right now. I don't think we should be concerned about that.
Great. Ease my fears. Does anyone else have any questions before I keep on asking? No? I'll let you guys continue.
We don't have much on the, I'm going to quickly talk about DW corridor. This is actually more clear in my mind. I'm not sure why I've lost the monitor. The DW corridor is much more complex. I think we all understand generally the geography that we're referring to, really from sort of South Main out to the mall. The master plan was fairly narrow in its consideration of what the design should look like for the DW corridor. And frankly, much of it was based on the idea of the former Dow chemical site being sort of an anchor as a potential train station location. What we now know is that the priority location for a commuter rail station in the south end of Nashua is actually to the south of the mall, potentially in Tingsboro. And so we're fairly confident that a train station at this location will not happen, but the idea of the corridor as a transit-oriented corridor, really geared towards making connections to that future commuter rail station, is very much in play still. I still think the idea is, much like we're talking about in the Amherst Street corridor, having collecting roads, pedestrian infrastructure, and bicycle infrastructure that will ultimately allow residents and other users of this area to get down to the commuter rail station. I think that's very much something that we have in mind. What's interesting to me as I look back at the master plan, and I had to reread this, is that it wasn't clear what the vision was. One of the recommendations was to create a corridor plan that envisions a different set of land use policies and considers what the ideal design vision is. There really wasn't a design vision articulated within the master plan clearly. And so I say that for context because I'll be giving you a recommendation in just a minute here. Just to talk a bit about the zoning that is existing in the corridor, and I'll go sort of north to south here. As you look up here, we're sort of in the car dealership district up here. This is a mix of GB, which is general business, HB, highway business, some residential. This is sort of an isolated residential neighborhood to the east here. But then as we move into the
Karen's ward.
Yes. As we get into the southern areas of the corridor, we have general business zoning, general industrial, park industrial, all commercial uses, With the exception of some very high density residential to the west side of the corridor, this is actually one of our densest sections of residential in the community because of all that residential that's sort of silent in a lot of ways, but exists and is very important to the health of the corridor and is a major contributor to many of the traffic and congestion issues that we have here. But what I really want to emphasize actually is the fact that nearly all of the area, including the mall, that's been discussed for redevelopment is within what's referred to as this transit-oriented development district. For the purposes of discussion tonight, let's consider that nearly a one-for-one comparable to the mixed-use overlay district. There are nuances to it, but what it does is it gives the planning board tremendous authority to approve certain uses, modify dimensional requirements, do many of the things that we talked about in the mixed-use overlay. The reason I say this is that with the exception of this area to the north that I'll show you in just a minute, this is very flexibly zoned. Any development could really happen within this corridor today, albeit we hope it will be in the context of this TOD and be transit-oriented in nature. The permitted uses, the dimensional standards that are in place, and to some level the design standards that are in place are all incredibly flexible at this point in time. The one exception is the area to the north, but if I sort of zoom in on that, hopefully everyone can see this, this is really the car dealership section of the city. And as much as I don't want to, accept defeat here, these are critical uses in some ways to our community, I do not believe that it is in our best interest, and it's my opinion that a rezoning of this to be either mixed-use overlay or transit-oriented development overlay is not prudent at this point in time. We are not going to get redevelopment here at any point in the near future. And frankly, maybe this is a controversial opinion, but we do need places for these uses. And unfortunately, this is sort of the concentration of them in the city. There are others, of course, in other corridors, but it would not be my priority to try to incentivize residential development in this specific section that's not already zoned for it. So at this time, I am not recommending any kind of rezoning in the DW corridor, but I want everyone to understand that we actually have a very permissive set of zoning regulations in place. And we try to exercise that and make the development community aware of that. But sometimes it is truly the market that's speaking when you're not seeing activity happen. It's not necessarily that the zoning is not asking for it. The one thing I should say, and I haven't looked at my phone because Director Cummings, I expect, might be texting me to say this right now, is that there is an action that the city could take, and it's something we've talked about actively, and that is the idea of doing more design level planning for some of these sections of the city, actually using city monies to develop concepts of what we might like to see as a blueprint for the development community if they were to come in and talk to us. It's something we've done to some extent through the master plan, but if we were to advance some of these areas, and specifically some of the strategic parcels in these areas, it may need to be through some level of actual concept planning on the site to give them a sense of what the community wants. So I just want to put that out there for your consideration. Happy to talk about DW corridor or other sections. And then Sam does have a little more in the land use code if you prefer he jump right into that this time.
Any other questions on DW? Oh, yes.
Thanks. I think some of this is probably part, at least the middle part of it's probably in my ward. I think it's mostly the apartments, Royal Ridge and all those. How are we for development right now? Are we full down, or what's our vacancy, I guess, on some of the places, that whole corridor, I guess?
Yeah, great question. I think there are two ways to answer. From a unit vacancy, I don't know. If the vacancies are accurate, vacancy numbers that we're hearing are accurate, we're below 1%. Okay. But I don't know with each development how many vacant units they actually have within the residential structures. But I have to believe, particularly with the wonderful access this corridor has to the highway and other retail opportunities and other things that families need, I tend to think that's very sought after real estate for folks looking for a condo or a rental apartment. One thing I don't know if you were asking this, Alderman Tebow, but as far from a build out perspective and how built out are we really, I don't know the answer to that. I haven't done an analysis to look at the max build ability of each of those different residential developments and whether they could be densified. I don't know the answer to that, but certainly it's something we could come back with some more information on to give you just a sense of the maximum number of units that could be permitted.
Follow
Are these all like 3-floor vape shops or, no, I'm just kidding.
Too soon.
I know they're popping up everywhere. So I look at that corridor and to me, it's kind of, I don't want to call it weird, but it's like, you got stuff back and then you got something in front of it.
Yeah.
Something behind, something in front of it. But it's not residential per se, except behind maybe Market Basket where you got Pheasant Run back there.
Yep.
It seems like there's space that can be used. And I know now that Toys R Us is gone, they're putting in an Amazon Fresh, so that parking lot's gonna be packed again and probably make sure all those places have vacancy of some sort. But it just seems like planners put things in originally. It was weird. And so it's not hard to get around necessarily, but obviously during the holidays, I mean, there's no exit 36 going, or I don't know what it is now in Mass, but they never created the one going the opposite way, so you can get off of it, but you can't go down through it. It's a great exit way if you're at the mall. It's perfect to get, to Nashua. I think that's the only problem, not having one to get off there. But it's weirdly constructed in a way, and some of it's very old stuff that's been there for many, many years, and some then was constructed in the 80s, obviously like the mall and stuff. And so it's a strange corridor, I think, and there's probably some things that could be done there if developers had, a shot at it.
Alderman Clemens and Alderman O'Brien.
So just this fun anecdote to Alderman Tebow's comments about the old exit 36, my buddy and I used to say, oh, you do the old exit 35, 36 combo, basically drive down 35, go back north and go up to 36 to get to the mall. Well, when they renumbered it, it's now exit 91 and 90, but it literally says old 35, old 36. I'm like, look at that. I'm like, now it's literally the old 35, old 36 combo. Anyway, so I am curious about if you've talked or had conversations with Simon Properties, because that has to be, the Pheasant Lane Mall has to be one of the last successful retail spaces in the United States, or at least that's like that. Because everywhere else, malls are dying, across the country. That one, for whatever reason, I think its location probably is the reason why it is so successful. That, and there's no sales tax, right? So, but I'm wondering if you've had conversations with them, if they're interested in redeveloping any of the mall property to add residential or things like that, even the mall itself.
I can represent that we have had inquiries from other uses. Those have not been residential in nature. And I think one of the challenges with the mall, obviously, is there's a de facto association that exists, but there are, in fact, individual property owners. We were talking about this before the meeting. It's made up of several odd-shaped properties. I'm sure you're familiar, Alderman Clemens. And so, it is certainly, it's one of the city's larger opportunities, particularly in the context of rail, to talk about whether there might be a village-style opportunity there. The challenge will be bringing along all of the property owners there in a shared vision. And even the inquiries that we've had they've been piece by piece. They have not involved multiple units. They've been, in some cases, store by store even. And they have not been residential in nature at this point in time. I think, to your point, the mall has been fairly well performing. Vacancy is low. It's an anomaly in that way. From Sam's prior location in Concord, the Steeplegate Mall is in a very different condition. And so it's, we're fortunate in that way, but unfortunately it hasn't necessarily brought about the same conversation about what the strategic opportunities of that property will be.
Well, yeah, so that, I don't want to assume, but are you talking about the actual existing structures that are in the mall right now? Because what I was thinking of was what's around the mall, which is vacant land. And so that's kind of more what I was thinking as, and I don't know why, I don't know why. I always go up to the outlets in Merrimack and I say to myself, why did they make this just retail. Because you walk around it and you go, wouldn't this be really cool if like there was apartments up there and it was a place where people, it was like a real village instead of some place that shuts down at like 8:30 at night and it's like a ghost town. And yeah, I don't know. So I'm wondering if like that opportunity exists, or I have to imagine that the other thing is too, is how receptive would they be to putting, a rail station on their property in Tingsboro. I don't know if any of those things have been discussed, I guess.
I can't answer many of those questions directly, unfortunately, but we have not had any conversations about the peripheral open space or parking areas and potential redevelopment of those. I will say I share your sentiments about the outlets. I think that's why they're introducing a residential component, albeit in a different section now. It's always been a bit odd to me that wasn't chosen. Perhaps there are reasons, but yeah, I think this is a prime site for that. What I do know is that NHDOT, at their the current point in their process, they are making inquiries to potential strategic partners, and that involves property owners that might be adjacent to where the stations are contemplated. I don't know if they've spoken directly to, I believe the property owner would likely be Seritage and the Simon Association generally. I can't speak to any conversations that they've had, but certainly I would like to believe that Simon is well aware of the conversation that's happening and hopefully factoring that into their redevelopment plans. One other thing I can represent is that it's not just been one unit within the mall that's inquired about redevelopment. It has been multiple. And so there's a conversation happening. I just don't know exactly what it looks like, and I wish I did. Does that answer all your questions?
Yeah, no, it does. And I think what it goes back to is the fact that, I think what your answer goes back to the fact that, the existing use there is not like other parts of this country right now. For whatever reason, it is successful. And I mean, and that's good. And that's good for Nashua, and it's good for the mall, and it's good for the businesses that are there. But it doesn't lend itself well to a conversation of what do we want to add to this. And so because people, if you have the moneymaker, you don't want to mess with it, right? So, but I'm hopeful that that's the type of development that I would like to see down in that area, is more residential mixed in with what's there now, however we can do that. And whether that means, you tear down things that are there and rebuild and things like that. I just hope that, in some fashion we can get there. But Nashua is unique, where our retail area is doing well, and that's a good thing. And but hopefully we can, with the spot where the chemical company was, we can do some things that are a little bit different there, and maybe it'll work. It will be successful and work its way down to the border. So, thank you.
I think we had Alderman O'Brien.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Probably just provide information to Alderman Theobald, but for what I remember of the DW, particularly around the Spippick Road area, in the DW highway, you got to keep in mind, it appears to you to be willy-nilly, and it was, but I don't think there was much direction going on at that particular time. Case in point, where I think two guys, cigars used to be Moody Tank, where they used to make oil tanks and some fire trucks, believe it or not. And right down, I think the last structure that had anything was Royal Crest Apartments. And then they built the Royal Crest Mall, and that extended. And then you got to remember the good old Green Ridge Turkey Farm, to which they actually had turkeys for one time hanging out in front of it. I'd like to see the turkeys out there in the DW today in front of Barnes and Nobles. The life expectancy will probably be 30 seconds, but anyways. But the thing is, it was all done willy-nilly. And Willow String Plaza, you got to remember, that was the old Bluestone dump. The dump fire that never went out. I think it's still burning, but I don't know, But that was always regrettable to get assigned down to the dump, you know, and everything. So it poses me with the question, we have brownfields down there. And what's our intentions, or where are we gonna go with that? Because the former dump itself, yes, they did put the build over it. In case anybody wonders if the parking lot is actually dropping, it is, you know. Every time you go to step up onto the curb, it gets higher and higher because of the contraction of the material underneath it. Those aren't really light poles as much as methane gas release devices. And we have the former Grace Chemical site at the end of a Pouzon or Poison Ave, you know, depends. Which way would you say it?
Adventure Way.
Adventure, oh yes, it's Adventure Way, that debates that whole argument right there. But we used to enjoy that, you know, getting dispatched to Grace Chemical on Pouzon Ave, yeah. But what's the intention there? You know, because that is a good piece of land. I was hoping rail would go there. I know that fell through. But, you know, how long is it going to be a brownfield? And what do we anticipate?
Yeah. Great question, if I may. Yeah, so I do want to point out that with the Dow Chemical site specifically off of Adventure Way, East Bipprick Road, there was actually an approval that was granted by the planning board last year for a Costco relocation, large self-storage facility, gas station on that property on the, what I would refer to as the south side of the property adjacent to East Bipprick Road. It would have ultimately connected East Bipprick Road in Adventure Way. Going back to that point of making connections between streets, we were trying to do that. Unfortunately, that application was appealed to the court and has since been remanded to us, so the future is a bit unknown for the Dow Chemical site. But what I can also say is that on the northern portion, that really is the more contaminated portion, if we're talking scale or on a spectrum, that portion was anticipated to be a large surface parking lot for the train station because of the activity use restrictions that are in place on that land. Unfortunately, there will need to be some capping that's done, and there seemed to be a shared purpose or a shared benefit to actually create a surface parking lot for the rail station there. It's also important to point out that that section of land is actually restricted such that residential cannot be built on it. And so while mixed use might be contemplated and a lifestyle center was contemplated for that area about 20 years prior, the idea of actually developing residential in the Dow Chemical site is very, very limited unless it's done to the southern portion of the site. But there is market interest. It's currently owned by an entity that has interest in redeveloping and has actually moved forward with approvals. There's also an interest, I should say as well, that there might be a larger connection built towards the circumferential highway at such time that the north of the parcel is actually developed. Relative to the, I'm not sure how I should refer to the area, but the Toys R Us location, the dump, there are ongoing challenges with that site. Even with the planned Amazon Fresh that's supposed to go into that site, there were complications with the moving of the parking lot, the moving of the building to some extent. It poses some interesting architectural and structural engineer challenges for any occupants of that area. But tenancy remains fairly good. The uses are fairly active down there. They're complementary to each other. I'm not sure that that's a redevelopment priority at this time, but it sort of has done well as a capped site with the tenants dealing with it as the issues arise. So there's no immediate plan to redevelop that, in my opinion.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I remember when there was 2 bowling alleys down there. Now we have none. So I heard a rumor that maybe in that same site that we're talking about, the Dow Chemical site, that it could be an electric car parking lot to charge cars. Is any truth to that? That would be something that we would look at to put there?
I certainly don't want to say it's not something that we would want there. I think I hate to make a cliche statement, we are trying to encourage electrical charging infrastructure to the extent that we can on any large-scale multifamily or non-residential site. We haven't necessarily seen the market buy into that just yet, but I think we're getting there. We might need to do that through the land use code update, actually. I don't think that we would object to it. I'm not aware of any such proposal. You know, I wouldn't be able to comment if it's in a certain stage of development, but I can comment that I'm not aware of that at this point in time. But again, we would encourage it. The mall has installed charging stations at certain locations around it. Other commercial entities and sites have installed charging infrastructure, and we're not opposed to that.
Yeah, I just, one follow-up. So I just saw in Tingsboro, I went to eat at the Olive Garden, and right down below there where the Outback used to be, it was like all kinds of charging stations. So I don't know if that's, you know, obviously that's in Tingsboro, but if that's, you know, where we're headed on some of that. But that's really off the topic of this, but I was just curious because I had heard that someone was interested in looking into that, so.
One thing that certainly is going to be in our new land use code is, you know, we're going to be strict, you know, clearly allowing charging station farms, essentially, I think, in some locations. I don't know what that will look like and how we'll codify it, but our old code did not contemplate that in any way. It was very gas station centric, and we're recognizing a clear shift, obviously, in alternative fuels, and we need to be aware of that. And so we'll be modifying the use table to reflect it.
So I do financing for a living, and particularly vehicle financing. And the largest impediment to somebody buying an electric vehicle these days is the fact that you can't, if you live in an apartment building, you don't have access to charge your car overnight. And so it basically eliminates anybody who lives in an apartment setting unless they have access to a plug, literally a plug, from buying those types of vehicles. So it is something that we do need to look at the land code, because if you live in a big apartment complex and you're parking your car, how are you going to charge it overnight? And the thing is, if you're commuting back and forth and things like that, you have to be able to charge it somewhere. I actually owned an electric vehicle for a while, and range anxiety is a real thing. And I know that, you know, now they're getting better at that, and you're seeing faster charge times and things like that. But we're a long way away. And until we figure out how to get more access to people who live in apartments, we're never going to overcome that.
Any more questions? Any more of the presentation?
Sure. So we'll move into the land use code conversation. So it's been really great to hear some of the comments around the table tonight, a lot of which really do point towards where we're headed. This land use code update really does build off of the vision of the master plan. And most of this is really going to focus on the Amherst Street corridor. Specifically, the form-based conversation. So the master plan had made several recommendations in many parts of the land use chapter of adopting form-based standards. So as Matt had alluded to earlier, the form-based code really looks at a predictability of the built environment as being the focal point, more so than being use-based. Obviously, it would be a massive step, and Concord is where I come from previously, is very close to adopting a form-based code, though a hybrid model where there still is a use table. So there's form-based standards to produce that predictable environment, but still certainly relying on separation of uses, as is a traditional Euclidean zoning. So while we look at this corridor, while we look at some of those images earlier where you do have these buildings that are fronting the streets, I think the comment about Route 1 is spot on, right? So if you have this product, this built environment that you say, this isn't quite what we're looking for, but we can also say that right now, but we want to rezone and we want to encourage density, but the built environment, the product, is of real concern, because we want something that is of high quality, but we're also going to run into the point where if it's successful, it's going to perpetuate itself, which then you run into questions about capacity issues. Do we, do we have the capacity out there on the roadway and the sewer and the water, and what sort of investments is the city as a taxpayer going to have to make? So that's when we start talking about making these street connections. And we do have the tools, we have many tools, in the planning arsenal. We have paper streets, we can talk about these connections, we can plan for these in the future. And we can also, start designating certain areas off of the corridor where we say, oh yeah, we do want to kind of encourage a village type of district, because we can see there's access coming south from the corridor, there's going to be cross access in the future, there's no big buildings impeding that. So this is an opportunity we can zone for that. This is all part of the conversation that we'll be having through this land use code update process. There's going to be a lot of conversations around this. This is actually, these are two images for the same district out of Concord's code. This looks drastically different from our current code. Pictures, easy to read charts. All of these have clickable links to the section in the code where you have your details for all your different standards. Alderman Clemens, you had mentioned these imposing buildings right on the street, right? So something that Concord is contemplating is what's called step backs. So say you go up 6 stories, if you want to go higher, you need to step back, 10 feet, from the edge of the building. So it's not as looming over, but you still get that height, you still get that density, but the feel on the street is not as imposing and enclosing. I also want to point out, we do have a lot of large open parking space areas on this corridor. There's a lot of real estate in those parking areas on the front of the street to create, 4, 5, 6 story, something with a setback, reasonable development. And while that, certainly creates one feel on the street, it creates an entirely new environment behind it. Because now you're in between sizable buildings. This could be leading towards, you have these cross connections through parking lots. This could start feeling like a village area. So I want to think about, you kind of get this layering effect from the corridor. And these cross connections can also relieve some of the traffic and the congestion. If I'm going to go have lunch over here to then go shopping over here, and all this is on the same side of the corridor, we can make those connections. Oh, and I also live now in the new apartment building that's set back, 1 layer further. So these sorts of connections, this layering, and the planning around that, so that these all serve each other, but also create a very positive built environment that will perpetuate growth and demand, because it's a successful area and people want to be there. And it is functional from a transportation perspective. This is just an example of the use table that Concord has. I want to point out that there are only 4 of these pages. Our current use table is much larger. The simplification involved in a form-based code where the product, again, is the built environment. You can really start to condense a lot of the uses so that it's much more developer friendly, it's much more approachable. You're not gonna have to splice hairs to try and really get down, oh, what is the use? Just throw it into this subsection of retail or something like that. The simplicity behind it breeds efficiency. While not adopted yet, we're hopeful that this will be successful for Concord and a model that other communities, Nashua included, can learn from. And I will say that from being heavily involved with this process, and especially the public outreach conversations with council members in Concord, it's a big change, but the idea behind it was very well received. And being developer friendly is always at the forefront of elected officials' minds, certainly from planning staff, because we're dealing with them. They want to have a positive experience. We want to be developer friendly. This is a very positive step for the development community in Concord, and something that I think that will be well received here as well. But again, big push on public engagement, big push with engagement with the development community and design professionals. So a little bit on our target schedule and what we're looking to get out of this. We'll be issuing an RFP by the end of the month. So we're hopeful that we'll have a contract by March of next year, start the project, start the process in April, and then hopefully by October, November of 2024, we'll be presenting a draft to this body. There's going to be a lot of engagement along the way. Interviews with key stakeholders, which, that can be the Chamber of Commerce, that can be other, bodies within the city, staff committees, many iterations of the Board of Aldermen and their respective committees as well. And we want any consultant that we bring on to be very familiar with the city. In Concord, we used a company out of Austin, Texas. They spent a lot of time in the city. They spent a lot of time flying out, getting to know the community. We drove around, we went into different neighborhoods, and getting a sense that we wanted a code that was based on what's on the ground. So that you don't have to go to the ZBA because you want to build a porch. Code for what's on the ground, plus a little bit. Think about the Southwest Quadrant. There's probably not going to be a lot of change there. It's a well-established, it has its character. We're not going to start throwing up 7-story apartment buildings there, but code for what's on the ground, and our neighbor wants to build a deck, not going to have to go to the ZBA for it, something like that. However, when we get into areas like the Amherst Street corridor, that's where we're going to be really form-based focused. And I'm not saying that we apply form-based standards everywhere in the community, because that just might be a level of design and regulation that just might not be necessary, because there's already a really clear built form that is accepted by residents and accepted by the development community for certain areas. But when we have a specific vision for something that's a little disjointed, feels a little weird, DW Highway or Amherst Street, clear visioning, clear engagement, and getting a good sense of what's desired there, but also having a strong sense of what the market can tolerate and what we can do based upon our infrastructure capacity, based on what we can do with what the market can sustain in terms of what we can build based on going from stick to steel, things like that. These are all going to be part of that conversation that we have in envisioning an idea for these design standards that will help to manifest that vision of a corridor. So in terms of just our deliverables, we'll have a code, obviously, and a zoning map that goes along with it. We really want to talk about compacting that use table, developing clear standards for lots, building design, parking and access, very important when we talk about these high volume corridors, as well as landscaping and placemaking standards that really make that product high quality. And then also clarifying, streamlining the permitting process, and having other standard things like your definition sections and things like that that are just clear and approachable.
Very interesting. I'm glad you guys have a solid plan with an RFP coming out very soon. Alderman Tebow.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is fascinating and exciting, and it makes me want to go home and play SimCity. You guys remember that game? I'll build my own Nashua. One of the things that I wish it was happening sooner. I look at it and I see October, November 2024. Yeah, I might be way voted out of office by then. But I think, I like how you guys are looking at different communities. I think, one thing I think in the past with Nashua is we've kind of stuck to we're old Nashua, we don't change kind of thing. And, we're starting to do that. And this is exactly what we need. We need simplicity. We need, ease of use, less things coming to the zoning board that don't need to come to the zoning board, and just better development out there. And I think this is a good start, and I'm looking forward to seeing what you guys put in front of us. And simplicity is the key, making stuff simple, making it easy, and building great developments out there and great properties. And we're going to grow. There's no doubt about it. We keep showing up on these lists of best everything, and we've already seen our capacity fill up, so we're going to keep growing. And if we build it, the people will come. So thank you so much to you guys for coming tonight. I appreciate it. So that was my stuff.
Anyone else? Alderman Clemens?
Yeah, I thank you for presenting this. Looks like a good timeline. I think, I hope we can stick to it. But I won't hold you to that. But no, I think it's well timed. Our codes are not business friendly, and that's what I've been told by many people who work in commercial real estate and just in that general, you know, building trades, and we're not easy to work in Nashua, and I think we got away with it for many years because of our location and because of where we are, and so it was kind of like those people dealt with it, but you know, we've also lost out because of that too. So I think it's about time that we looked to do things a little bit differently, and so I'm all for that. The only other thing I want to bring up, and I hope I'm okay to do this, I was serious when I said, you know, that we ought to consider a different way to look at how we can fund a new fire department and do it in a faster way. So I don't know if the opportunity for a TIF district or something like that any new tax revenue would go to fund the maintenance or the operations of a fire department would even be possible. But the way I look at it is, if we're gonna start redeveloping, especially in the Amherst zone, when you think about something like this, if that could be a component of this, where it's like, okay, we want to encourage all of this development to come along, what can we do to help that, and to also take the increased revenue, tax revenue, and put it towards something that we absolutely need in this city, which is a new fire department. So I don't know if that's an opportunity there or something that we can look at when we're discussing all of this.
My answer would be that I'd want to consult with Director Cummings before answering the question. I think we would need to take great care in defining what the TIF district is and what the improvements that need to be done, but you already know that. I do think we'd have to be very clear about specifically where we want it to. And as of right now, I'm not sure what area makes sense, whether it's the entirety of the Amherst Street corridor. As concerns there, we'd have to be confident that redevelopment is going to happen. And as of right now, I'm not sure that's the case. But if we were to install some very ambitious village-style zoning, and we had interest from the development community and they had a clear plan, I think it could be very much appropriate to do so. But we'd have to be confident that we actually have something happening in order to do it.
And so if I could, Mr. Chairman, that's more of what I was thinking. I was not thinking just in general, but if there was interest in doing something very like a project, or there was a developer that really was interested in what we had, you know, maybe we could pounce on that opportunity. Because obviously, as the chief said earlier in the meeting, it's the personnel and all of those expenses, and we're going to have to find a way to do that. And now, I don't know that you could necessarily do a TIF district and pay for personnel with it, but certainly you could offset the cost of building the apparatus and the things in it. So, you know, I just think we need to think outside of the box a little bit, because we have to be able to that's a priority, I think, of this community. So,
Certainly agree. Alderman Karen.
Yes, thank you. I really appreciated this presentation. Over the years, I've sat in on planning board meetings, zoning, and always wondered why we had so many different rules and regulations, and you had to come, as you say, to put in a porch or a driveway or something like this. So to try to standardize that and simplify it to make it easier for everyone involved, whether it's in your department or these boards and commissions, I think this is great. One question now, this thing in Concord, has that been finally approved, or is that in the final stage for approval on their codes?
It's in the final stages.
It is in the final, okay. And I'm glad to see that you reached out and are looking at what other cities are doing, because I think that really helps us. And as far as the automotive village, I remember when that was put in because we lived right behind it. So, but as Alderman O'Brien said, things were built on Daniel Webster Highway willy-nilly, and you know, somebody went out, the old Coach Inn went out, they put something else there. So it was there was no standardization. So this really will help, I think. So I really appreciate it. I enjoyed this because have never been part of PEDC other than their report. So this was quite interesting tonight. Thank you so much for doing that. Thank you.
Any other statement? Would it be too much of an ask? I don't know if we need to make a motion, but maybe by the next meeting or the meeting after, either November's or December's meeting, come with legislation that you vetted through Corporation Council on that specific spot up at Amherst Street.
Sure. What I can offer is I should be able to come back for the November meeting. Just to be clear about a couple other things I'll do on the way. I do want to speak directly or further with Director Cummins just to ensure that he's comfortable with the proposal. I will also speak to the planning board at some level as well. You know, they're an important part of this, obviously, albeit not the ultimate decision-making authority. We do want to make sure they're aware of any proposed legislation, but we'd be happy to bring something back with a more refined scope of what we're actually talking about doing. Be happy to.
Do we need a motion, Alderman O'Brien, for that? Would we need a motion for that, Alderman O'Brien?
No, I don't think so. I think if he supplies one with an idea, and I think that'll give us the opportunity at that particular time.
Thank you, Director. All right. Well, thank you both so much. I know this has been several months of conversation that panned out to a great presentation.
Excellent. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. All right. Communications.
There is none.
Unfinished business.
There is none.
Petitions.
None.
New business resolutions.
There is none.
New business ordinances.
None.
Table and committee.
None.
General discussion. Public comment.
Nice job, no problem. Lori Ortolano, 41 Berkeley Street. The presentations tonight were excellent, really well done. I enjoyed listening to them. I'd like to address, Alderman Moran, your comments at last evening's meeting and your leadership, what you showed in that chamber in responding to the public. I think I presented an email that very much upset you, and it caused a very strong reaction that I was doing something that was very misleading to the public. When I presented this email, I specifically stated, as I watched the video today, that I wanted your comments on, is this true? Okay. Alderman Jetty was very helpful in that he asked our attorney what his professional opinion was, and he provided that opinion without any, negativity from me on that opinion being provided. It's exactly what I wanted. And when the comments came out at the end, you made it very clear that I presented a lie. Really, I presented information from a former alderman whose name I actually X'd off because I didn't want to put their name out there. It had my name on it, so it came to me. I passed it to you folks to say, is this true? And it was a lie. And you said, I'm going to push back on this information every time. It always gets me right in the funny bone about silver spoon millionaires coming in here and acting like they are the crown jewel of the working class, pushing off information we don't know to be true until we ask legal counsel. And then you went on a diatribe about Governor Sununu. Then you said, this chamber is represented by the middle class. We represent the city. Everyone knows that. You can go to my Facebook page. Millionaires who are born with silver spoons in their mouths, who don't earn crap, have no respect from me. Very harsh. Now, honestly, you made yourself out to be the champion of the proletariat class. But I don't think you really are, because you can afford much more than I could at your age. Your children go to private Catholic school at St. Chris. You signed and auctioned off and paid $3,400 for your kid to be principal for the day. I couldn't afford that in my 30s. I didn't have that money. Now, my husband and I give a great deal of money to that church because we can afford it. But we did not have those opportunities. You sent a very strong message last night about who can come to this chamber and speak. And I heard some comments today. If you're poor, you don't belong in here. And if Melbourne Moran thinks you're a millionaire or whatever definition he has, don't come to share input. You're not welcome. You made a judgment that was horrendous, and you were a very poor example to your own children. Thank you.
I have no idea if that member of the public is a millionaire or not. I was very upset about millionaires who make poor decisions, who are policymakers in this state that shift down cost.
That's
I will,
not what you said.
I will say that we will let the record show. We'll let the record show that a member of the public who refused to apologize to children for the use of the C word on public television is upset with me because I don't like millionaires too much. And by the way, I'm doing well for myself. I have an issue with silver spoon millionaires, not millionaires who work their way up.
That's what you referred to me as. And I tried to...
I have no idea what your income is. You're not a policymaker. Why would I care?
Mr. Chairman, point of order. I offer this point of order for advice. I think the public had had their opportunity to speak. Short of that, with your rebuttal and the public's rebuttal, then it gets into a debate. And I would recommend, personally recommend, that this is a meeting, not so much as a debate format. So
that is true, Alderman O'Brien. You are correct.
So I would just say, as a point within the traditions of our chamber, best to leave it at this particular time and let's carry on.
Yes. Comments by Alderman. Alderman Tebow.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just a couple things. So, you know, to Alderman Clemens' last point about the fire station, I couldn't be more passionate. When I ran for office and I talked to the fire union, that's something I thought the city needed. You know, when fire and police, and I know this is not a popular opinion, but you know, the directors of health and human services, when they come to us, I don't think that they're not telling us the truth. I believe they're coming to us because they actually need something, and it's part of our job to figure out a way how to do that. And it's not always easy to just say, here's the budget, go do it, or here's the extra budget, go do it. Sometimes we do have to think outside the box. Sometimes it has to be a bond. Sometimes it has to be, if it can be done, a TIF. Maybe we have a chili cook-off with all the fire departments. I don't know. We got to figure out a way to do it because we need it, right? It's important to the city. And the last thing we want to do, you know, people had complaints about the barriers because they thought it was a safety issue. We just pulled them off. No one died. There was no safety issue. But not having enough fire stations in this city will be a safety issue. If it isn't now, it will be in the future. And we need to plan for it. We need to figure out a way to do it. I was a little surprised with Chief Buxton saying how many, I mean, I hear all the time about how many policemen were down. I was surprised to see how many firemen we were down as well. And so that's infrastructure that we have to have in the city. And we're gonna have to, you know, put our heads together and figure out a way to do that. And it can't be all this petty where we can't pay for this and we can't pay for that. That's essential. That's essential. We got to figure out a way, and there's got to be ways to do it. I'm still too new to know all those ways, but I'm certain there's something that we have to do that. You know, and I appreciate Matt, Director Sullivan, and Planning Manager Durfee coming tonight. I thought that was a great presentation, and hopefully we can do something on that soon. And just the last piece, you know, last night I was kind of harsh to the Budget Committee, or to all the Board of Aldermen, as far as being prepared for these meetings. And I was prepared last night to decide on whether we should go forward with that budget or not, or the Budget Committee ask on the escrow account. And I believe the committee work is some of the most important work we do. And when we meet like this, I learned a ton tonight. I thought it was a great meeting, great presentations, great speakers. And if we're not ready to move forward on something, then you have another meeting. And we don't have to refer it back. It should have another one. So that's kind of what I was saying last night. It wasn't necessarily, you know, going after people as much as it was. I think some of these things are so important that I think as a board we need to be taking the right amount of time with them. And sometimes we rush things. And sometimes we have to, depending on time. But one thing I didn't see come up last night was no one on any of their bingo cards had, can we take away the $300,000 for lawsuits in the city? if we stopped having frivolous lawsuits, we would not have to add 300,000 to the escrow. But nobody had that. Nobody put that down last night.
Because they're not frivolous, you moron.
Call me what you want. The city will know. The city will know. And so nobody put that out there. Alderman Sullivan did. None of us did. I was thinking it. Why do we need to spend so much money on legal fees for no reason?
Can we have quiet, please, in the chamber? Thank you.
You know, we talked about decorum, we talked about respect. She comes here, there's never any respect for us, but we have to be respectful to her. And I have been. I haven't said any names tonight. Alderman Moran hasn't said any names tonight.
Unusual night.
Please, quiet in the chamber, miss.
But I think it's important that we still have decorum in this Board of Aldermen. We're trying to do stuff for the city. And when impediments go up for us, it's hard to do the things we need to do to take care of the city that we have, the people that we need to care for. And it's just impediments. So, thank you.
Anyone else? Alderman O'Brien.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I would like to thank my fellow aldermen. Let me give the usual caveats or legal plea. I was a member of National Fire Rescue for 35 years and rode the tide. And like I say, I've seen a lot of deficiencies, that have occurred. And right now, we're discussing about, we gave the public back $4 million to help offset the tax. But other aldermen have done that in the past years too. And it comes at a cost of something, okay? And some of the cost of something has been the fire department. I mean, if something is a problem, like the last fire station added was 45 years ago, it's 45 years of a particular problem. I'm glad we had the discussion tonight and to maybe attune ourselves into thinking. But there's other things that haven't been mentioned. We have 2 parking garages that are in dire need of structural repairs. Those are the people's buildings too, as much as it's important. And what the people got to realize, and I'm very sympathetic, I understand. But if we have a major failure over there of some of the concrete joints or different things or drainage system, with inflation looming on the horizon, if it does occur, the replacement costs will be, out of sight, out of mind. So, although I'm very sympathetic, like I say, I pay taxes too. At what point do we as aldermen really got to draw the line and really face the music and explain to people who don't really have the inner workings that we particularly see? We're the ones that sit on the committees. Like I say, 45 years of not building another fire station. How many people have sat in this horseshoe and done that? It didn't occur overnight. So maybe it might be a trigger to a new trend to maybe, and in this economy, God will help us. I understand that. But trying to get, the thing, to get it together. And again, to refer back, the infrastructure that's out there that needs to be really taken a look at. There was a proposal to cut back 1 position on parking, yet we're leaving money in the street because we can't get people to work for the city. Who wants to, get in confrontations for $15 an hour over a parking space? And people will probably try it and work it, but then get quickly frustrated. So is the $25, an hour, is that the right price? I don't know. But cutting position definitely ain't gonna get us anywhere, So we need to take a look at, the fire department's one little blip on the horizon, I see, and it's gonna be a lot more that as we're coming down that we need to take a look at. But I thank you all for listening. I think Chief Buxton did a very good job in presenting it, at least to make us aware of it, of some of the issues and looking. And particularly when people come in with plans to build There's not enough fire marshals and, you know, to go out and do site inspections. So it is something that needs to be addressed. And how we're gonna do it, I haven't got the magic answer, you know, but may have to make some tough choices, or whether we're gonna nurture this city or watch it die. It's a choice to be made right here, so thank you.
Alderman Karen.
Yes, thank you. I just wanted to say that the two presentations today was excellent. They did a great job. I didn't realize that the fire department only does training in the springtime for new employees, so that's new to me, that, you know, I didn't know. And like Alderman O'Brien, I worked for the city for over 45 years, and I remember when they talked about building the fire station off of Amherst Street on Thornton Road, which is now a playground, because they were not getting anywhere. But the problem we have in this city, and I think we can all agree, we don't take care of our infrastructure. We build, and then we let it sit there, like the garages. And I have people who've worked for Public Works who say, when's the last time anyone looked at that structural component of those garages? We don't. And then something catastrophic happens, and now we have to spend a lot of money instead of taking care of it. It took them almost 40 years to get Mulberry Street done, when it should have been done when I was there back in 1977. You know, we were there for 10 years, and we had no elevator. There were things that so wrong, but look at how long it took for the city to step forward. And yes, we always have things to do. We need to have employees for the police, the fire, health department, DPW, because if we don't get our streets plowed, you're the first one who's going to get a phone call because your street wasn't done 10 minutes after the snow stopped. So we have to prioritize, but we have to think about the future. You can't just do something. That's why we put in SURF way back in the late 60s to be able to buy the equipment that we needed, especially police vehicles and fire trucks. So I think the Board of Aldermen, we can get all this feedback about spending and spending, but as Alderman O'Brien said, do you want your city to grow and be vibrant and be the safest city and be the best place to live down the road? Then you've got to start thinking about long-term and what are we going to do. And I am glad, I've only been back for a few months, but I think your decorum has been excellent. Sometimes we want to say things that we really shouldn't be saying, so better to think about it rather than say it. But I respect you all. I think you all have opinions. You may or may not agree, as I said before, but you have a right to say it. I can agree to disagree with you, but we don't make it personal, because tomorrow's another day. So I appreciate it, and sitting on this committee for the first time after 10 years is very enlightening for me, so thank you.
Alderman Clemens, anything? All right, before I turn it over to Alderman O'Brien, I will just say that I think it is very pathetic to bring someone's children into any type of conversation. Some people would call people like that losers, but I won't go as far as to say that today. But I will say that I will defend my children to the very extent possible every day. Alderman O'Brien.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would like to make the motion that the Planning and Economic Development Committee on October 12th, 2022 be adjourned.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye. We are now adjourned at 9:14 p.m.
Say a mouse.
A mouse, a house.
I let my wife deal with mice, I don't deal with that.
We have a cat too.
Oh, really? Yeah, before when we didn't have cats, we had mice and I'm like, you deal with it.
You deal